Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at subunit 9.8, which is on the topics of galvanic and electrolytic cells. However, just so you all know, I am going to hold off on covering the topic of electrolytic cells until subunit 9.11. It just makes more sense to me to put it there. So let's get started. All right, so both galvanic and electrolytic cells, which we will cover a little bit later, both fall under the big umbrella heading of electrochemistry, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the interaction between chemical and electrical energy. It's using chemical reactions to harness electrical power. And galvanic cells, sometimes in some textbooks are called Voltaic cells, same thing, Voltaic, galvanic, are a perfect illustration of this interaction. And in order to understand a galvanic cell and what's going on, we need to review the term that is redox reactions, okay? Reduction and oxidation, what does that mean? We looked at this back in Unit 4, I believe. So it's been a little bit. And I gave you all a little mnemonic device to help you remember what oxidation and reduction mean. Leo the lion says GR, and of course these letters stand for something. When a particular substance loses electrons, which means its charge, its oxidation state would increase, that is by definition oxidation. When a particular substance gains electrons, meaning its charge or its oxidation state decreases because electrons are negative, that is reduction. Okay, so that was just a little bit of review. And a little bit more review, if you guys will recall, back from when we first looked at redox, if a reaction, an overall reaction, is considered a redox reaction, that means that the overall reaction can be split into two what we called half reactions. And because it's called redox, we have to have one of each. One substance being reduced, one substance being oxidized. And if you look at these individual half reactions, you can see what is happening to the copper, first of all. It's going from its ion form, +2, to its solid form, which has an overall charge of 0. So that is a decrease in charge. We can see that the copper ion is gaining electrons. That's reduction. Whereas in the zinc reaction, we're going from solid elemental zinc, which has an overall charge of 0, to its ion form +2. The charge has increased and electrons are being lost on the product side. So that's review. So how does that tie into whatever a galvanic cell is? Well, we're going to use a reaction just like this to harness some electrical energy. And this is a very basic, rudimentary setup for what a galvanic cell looks like, okay? You might simply have two beakers, okay? Those yellow bars are made of metal, and the white that is connecting them is a metallic wire. So here we go. If we look at this, okay, the reaction that's on the left, that zinc reaction, these are the same two half reactions that were on the previous slide. Okay, and just to help you get your bearings a little bit here, and we're going to go through what are the parts of a galvanic cell in a lot more detail. But this bar on the left here would be made of solid zinc, and zinc ions in aqueous form would be floating around in a solution in that beaker. Maybe it's a beaker of zinc chloride or something. It's anything that has zinc ions. And on the right-hand side, this yellow bar would be made of solid copper, and we would have copper ions floating around in the beaker. Again, maybe it's copper 2 chloride, something like that. Copper 2 ions in aqueous form. Okay, so these are the same two half reactions. Okay, let's focus our attention first on the one on the left. And I can see that the zinc half reaction is producing, giving away those 2 electrons. They're on the product side. This is the half reaction that was oxidation. And on the right-hand side, copper is gaining 2 electrons. That's reduction. Okay. Now, what's so special about this? Well, those 2 electrons on the left-hand side from that zinc half reaction, zinc gets rid of these 2 electrons, and where do they go? Well, they are going to flow through this wire in this direction. And isn't that convenient? Because the reaction on the right, that copper half reaction, needs to gain electrons. What a convenient little mix we've got here, where you link up one reaction that is getting rid of electrons with another reaction that needs to gain them. Electrons will flow through that wire, and ladies and gentlemen, anytime electrons are flowing, that is by definition electrical current. Okay, so that's how we harness a chemical reaction into electrical power. And that is the general setup for a galvanic cell. So in this case, the electrons are flowing from left to right. Electrons are, just so you all know, always going to flow from the oxidation side over to the reduction side. Okay. Now, there's an issue though. With this setup, the system will start, and yes, we will get flowing current, we'll have electrons flowing, but only for maybe just a split second, and then the current will stop flowing. And the question is why? Those of you that have a strong physics background might already kind of see this answer. If this were a physics class, we would say this is not a complete circuit. Okay, so let's remember, electrons are flowing in this direction. Okay, so what? Well, that is going to cause, if you think about it, electrons are negative, that's going to cause a big buildup of negative charge in this beaker on the right. And that's going to result in a big buildup of positive charge on the left, and that's a problem. In order for charge to flow, we need sort of a constantly moving conveyor belt of charge. Okay, so I'm going to show you on our next slide how do we fix this problem of it not being a complete circuit. But before I switch to the next slide, this is sort of the general setup for a galvanic cell. And before I move over to the next slide, there is a more everyday term for a galvanic cell. Ladies and gentlemen, a galvanic cell is a battery. Think of what the purpose of a battery is to provide electrical power. So we're going to see what does a galvanic cell look like in a little bit more detail. Okay. I know there's a lot going on in this image. Don't be overwhelmed. We're going to break it down. Okay. First thing I want you to recognize, these are the same two half reactions we were just looking at. This is our oxidation half reaction. This is our reduction half reaction. Okay. We can see, just like on the previous slide, the electrons are flowing from the zinc half reaction, or here's a word that we use a lot, the zinc half cell, to the copper half cell. I want you to notice in this picture, in the middle of the wire is something called a voltmeter. That is not impeding the flow of electrons. It is simply a device that measures the voltage, how much electricity is flowing through this wire. Okay. Now, from the previous slide, I said something about how we have this imbalance of charge because the electrons are flowing from left to right, and we're getting a big buildup of negative charge in the copper half cell, and a big buildup of positive charge in the zinc half cell. So how do we fix this problem? We put in something called a salt bridge. Now guys, a salt bridge can be made of a variety of things. It can be a sponge, it can be a strip of paper towel even. Sometimes it's a flexible column of gel. It can be made of different things, but the key is, whatever it is, has some ions in it. Not just any ions, they have to be spectator ions. Remember, that term means ions that are not a part of the overall reaction. In this case, the overall reaction involves zinc and copper. Sodium ion and nitrate ion, not involved. Okay, so what? Well, think about it, guys. If we're getting a big buildup of negative charge on the right half cell, a way to combat that would be to have an ion like Na plus flowing into that copper half cell. That would sort of negate that big buildup of negativity on the right. And the same thing on the left, just vice versa. If we're having a big buildup of positive charge, how can we combat that? We could take a spectator ion like nitrate, which is negative, and have it flow into that zinc half cell. That would sort of negate or cancel out that big buildup of positive charge. So a functioning galvanic cell is going to have the two metal electrodes, like the zinc and the copper, connected with a wire. You'll have a voltmeter in there to measure the voltage. And you also need a salt bridge to complete that circuit. Okay, so that's really important. Okay, now a few other things to talk about. I want you all to pay attention to this blown up image down here on the left-hand side. It's showing a blown up view of what is happening to that zinc electrode. And if we look at our half reaction, the zinc solid atoms are being converted into aqueous zinc 2+ ions. They're floating off into the solution. So think about it. That means that this bar of zinc is literally disintegrating as this galvanic cell runs. It's losing mass over time. If we measured the mass of that zinc electrode at the beginning of time, ran the galvanic cell for 2 hours, came back and massed the zinc electrode again, it would be lighter. The mass would have decreased, okay, because those atoms are being converted into zinc ions. We're not losing mass, conservation of mass. That mass has to go somewhere, but the mass from the bar, those atoms are being converted into aqueous ions. And then if you look over on the right-hand side, it's the opposite. Look at the half reaction. The copper ions are being converted into solid copper atoms, which glom on to that copper electrode. So this electrode, the copper electrode, is gaining mass over time because those aqueous ions are being converted into copper atoms. Okay, so that's something else to take note. The last thing that I want to say is just some of this vocabulary here. You have the terms anode and cathode, okay? Wherever oxidation is taking place, that half cell is called the anode. Wherever reduction is taking place, that is called the cathode. Easy way to remember that designation, guys. The word anode starts with a vowel, so does the word oxidation. They both start with vowels, whereas reduction and cathode both start with consonants, okay? The final thing I want to say, and then we're going to move to the next slide. Something that you might want to write down, I'm going to say it a couple of times. Electrons always flow in the direction from anode to cathode. Always, no exceptions. Okay, let me say that one more time. Write this down. Whether we're talking a galvanic cell or later on we're going to look at electrolytic cells, doesn't matter. Electrons always flow from anode to cathode. Okay? So today's lesson is really all about understanding all of the different parts of a galvanic cell, what's going on, why is it happening, okay? So that's the basic makeup of a galvanic cell, a battery. Okay, now, a few things to keep in mind. What if some of the species involved in these galvanic cell reactions are not solid? Like what if they're liquid, aqueous, gas? Keep in mind, guys, we have to have a solid electrode. We have to have, in fact, 2 solid electrodes, those pieces, those metal bars in a galvanic cell. Now, what am I talking about, other states of matter? Well, let me give you an example, 2 examples actually. What if one of my half reactions looked like, looked like this? Okay. Those 2 iron ions are both in aqueous form. There is no solid iron in this half reaction. There's nothing solid in this half reaction. Both of those species are aqueous. Okay? Or what if I had a half reaction like this? Okay. The F- on the product side is in aqueous form, and the fluorine on the reactant side is in gaseous form. Again, both of these half reactions that are written on the screen, they have to have some kind of solid metal electrode in the half cell in order for the galvanic cell to run. So what do you do if one or both of your half reactions don't even involve a solid? What do? Well, if that's the case, typically the electrode is going to be made of either platinum or graphite. These are both materials that are very conductive. They'll allow electrons to flow, but they're fairly unreactive. They're not going to interfere with the chemical reaction going on. Okay, so just needed you all to know that. So let's look at a sample problem. We're going to talk through this first one together, and then I'll give you one to try on your own. Okay, so we are given an image of a galvanic cell, and I want you to notice that the electrons and arrows showing which way they're flowing, that's been drawn in. In the next subunit, you guys are going to learn how to predict which direction they are flowing without being told in a picture, but we'll get to that. This particular question, you are being told which way the electrons are flowing. And the first question, first part of this says, which half cell is the anode, the right or the left half cell? What is going to happen to the mass of the zinc electrode as the cell operates? Is it going to increase or decrease? And describe the motion of the ions in the salt bridge. So let's look at each part of this question one at a time. All right, so part A said, which half cell is the anode? The one on the right or the one on the left? And guys, remember what I said? I asked you to write it down. Electrons always flow from the anode to the cathode. So we can tell that the aluminum half cell is the location of the anode. Technically, guys, the word anode means the metal electrode itself. That's why it says the aluminum half cell contains the anode. I don't think you would lose points if you said the aluminum half cell is the anode. I think that would be fine. Electrons are flowing from that half cell, indicating that oxidation is taking place there. Remember, the anode is where oxidation takes place. Part B says, what will happen to the mass of the zinc electrode as the cell operates? Well, before we answer that question, let's think about what is the half reaction occurring in that zinc half cell. Electrons are coming into that half cell, meaning they're going to be on the reactant side. Okay, that means that the zinc ions are merging with those electrons to create solid zinc. That's the reduction half cell. So now that we can think about that, let's look at that half cell and think about what must be happening to the mass of that electrode. And I said the mass of the zinc electrode will increase because aqueous zinc ions are reduced to solid zinc atoms, which are deposited on that cathode or that electrode. Okay, so the zinc electrode must be gaining mass over time. Okay, part C says describe the motion of ions in the salt bridge during the cell operation. Okay, again, in this particular picture, electrons are flowing left to right. We're getting a big buildup of negative charge on the right side. So those positive potassium cations must be migrating to the right half cell, while those negatively charged nitrate anions are migrating to the left. Okay? So I want you guys to try one on your own. You've got an image given to you. Okay? I want you to notice that you are not told in the picture which way the electrons are flowing, but if you read the introduction to this question very carefully, you should be able to figure it out. So pause your video, see how you do with this one. Okay. Before we answer any of the questions, I want us to look at this introductory paragraph and figure out for ourselves which way must the electrons be flowing, because it's not told, we're not told that in the picture. Okay, we have a copper electrode, a tin electrode, and it says, as current flows through the cell, the student determines that the copper electrode increases in mass and the tin electrode is decreasing in mass. Okay, well, think about the half reactions for that. If copper is increasing in mass, that means that the, oops, let me change color. The copper solid must be a product, okay? Because it's gaining mass. We're making more solid, which means this is what the half reaction must look like, okay? The electrons are coming in to the copper half cell, which tells me that the tin half reaction must look like kind of the opposite. The tin half reaction is losing the electrons. So guys, what does that mean? That means the electrons are flowing in this direction. Okay? Keep in mind, guys, galvanic cell images, the electrons don't always flow left to right. Sometimes they flow from right to left. They will, however, always flow from anode to cathode. Okay? But this information they told us about which electrode was increasing in mass, which electrode was decreasing, that allowed us to figure out which way the electrons must have been flowing. So on this next slide, I've just put in some arrows. Now that we know that, let's answer those questions. Okay. So part A says, identify the electrode at which oxidation is occurring and explain your reasoning. Remember, guys, electrons always flow from anode to cathode. Anode is where oxidation is taking place. So I said, because the student observes that the tin electrode is decreasing in mass, those tin atoms must be being converted into tin ions, which is oxidation. Okay. Part B says as the mass of the tin electrode decreases, we were told that, where does the mass go? Conservation of mass. You can't just go off into nowhere. The mass is changed. The tin atoms are going into the solution as tin ions. Okay. All right, part C says in the expanded view of the center portion of the salt bridge, okay, shown in the diagram, draw and label a particle view of what occurs in the salt bridge as the cell begins to operate, and we don't have to draw in any solvent molecules like water. Okay. Now, based on the way those red arrows that I drew in there, there's going to be a big buildup of negative charge in the left-hand side, that copper half cell. So how do we combat that? We're going to have some positively charged potassium ions flowing to the left, and some negative nitrate ions are going to flow to the right, okay, to combat that imbalance in charge. If ever a problem came up where you were not told what salt is in the salt bridge, guys, you can pick any soluble salt that you want to go in that salt bridge. As long as the ions do not interfere with the overall redox reaction, they can be any ions you want. Typically an AP question, though, is going to tell you what ions will be in the salt bridge. Okay, so today's lesson was really all about the nuts and bolts of what comprises a galvanic cell. What are the parts? What's happening? What's flowing this way? What's flowing that way? How do you know? And what we're going to look at in particular in our next lesson is what kind of voltage can we get out of this setup? Because remember, a galvanic cell is just a battery. And so we're going to do a little bit of number crunching in the next subunit to see how much voltage are we getting out of this battery. So I hope you guys have learned a little something today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.